Hello, everybody. My name is Christopher DeLouis, and at the time of recording this, I am a Doctor of Musical Arts candidate at West Virginia University. I'm here today to provide some guidance and some insight into what to think about and what to pay attention to when preparing Pierre Lantier's Sicilienne for a college audition. The first thing I'd like to talk about today is errors or things that are missing from the saxophone part that you should write down and include in your score so you can execute them properly. The first thing on this first page at the very end of the fourth line, we have an F sharp that leads us into the fifth line. This part here should start at about a piano dynamic. This will give us a bit more freedom and a lot more room to grow and move material that will happen after this. Continuing down on this first page, after our two measure rest, we have that first E natural, and this here should be played at about a forte dynamic because this section is quite different than what has happened before, and this louder dynamic will help improve this contrast and make it more audible to the audience. Moving on to the second page, we go all the way down to the third to last line, and on that third to last line in the second measure, the second beat of that measure, we have an E flat. And this E flat should be a 16th note instead of an 8th note, because with that 8th note we have an extra 16th in the measure, and that's just not correct there. And on the next line, so the second to last line of the second page, in the very last measure, we have a missing 8th note. That 8th note should come from adding a dot to that first quarter note B flat. So this is the second to last line, the very last measure of that line. The first B flat there should be a dotted quarter note instead of a regular quarter note. And again, in this measure, that mezzo forte that is notated should be underneath the 8th note B flat at the end of that measure after the breath mark instead of that quarter note there in the middle. So let's talk about the music now. So right from the beginning, we have an andante tempo marking. Well, what does that mean? I think for a piece like this, with its very elegant and flowing style, a tempo marking between 52 and 62 beats per minute for the dotted quarter note would be a good choice. Not too fast, but it's not unbearably slow. And this mezzo forte, right at the beginning, maybe like a mezzo forte minus or so. Not a full mezzo forte, just so we can keep this, style quite gentle. So let's take a look at some of these rhythms right from the start that will probably cause some issues. So right on the very first full beat of that first full measure, we have a quarter note and an 8th note that are tied together. But that 8th note has a tenuto under it. What that means is we should be re-articulating that note and making sure it's an audible re-articulation. So something like this. That's how I would go about that. I know some other people like to kind of make this piece a little bit bouncy. So they'll put a lot of space in between that 8th note and the quarter note. So, but how I like to interpret this is, so not as bouncy as the way some people do it, but there is a little bit of space between the two. So making sure we re-articulate that tenuto 8th note after that quarter note there. Now, what about this second beat? We have a dotted 8th note, 16th note, then another 8th note. We need to make sure that we're not rushing that 16th note, or we're not cutting it too short, that sort of stuff. So I'm sure as you've looked throughout the score, you've noticed that these rhythmic patterns happen a lot. So we need to make sure that we're consistent throughout too. So let's continue on. I will play through this first couple of maybe the first two lines here to give you an example. that's how I would go about that. Now, some technical things that happen in the second line. In that third measure of that second line where we have that G flat, I'd recommend using our TF fingering. So that is our normal F, 1, 2, 3, 4, with one of our side keys here. I'm sure there's a fingering for that in a fingering chart, and maybe in your book, or you can look that up online. It's hard to demonstrate here. So after this, we have this initial setup with the main melody, I would say. We have this E flat leading us into the third line. We have an octave there. We have to make sure our octaves are in tune. It's very apparent when they are not. And in this section, I like to kind of think of it with maybe like a poco più mosso sort of thing. So we have a lot more rhythmic activity. We have a lot more motion. And I think maybe just pushing the tempo just a little bit gradually throughout this section, and then settling back down when we get into that initial material again. So again, this is the material starting on the third line. I would think of it kind of growing in terms of tempo. And I would then, when we come back after the fourth line in that last measure, I would maybe kind of slow down there, a little bit of a poco rit. So here's how that would sound. So I guess I hear most of that in the crescendo in that ascending line leading up to that high C sharp there in the fourth line. So after this section, we have, where I told you to mark piano, kind of a return to the material that we have from the very beginning. The things here is making sure our high palm key D sharp is in tune. That note is, as we know, most of those palm key notes are pretty sharp. So I would recommend using just our C2 fingering rather than both of them. But that, again, that does depend on your instrument. Maybe both C1 and C2 is perfectly in tune for you. But for me, I like to use just the C2. And so we're piano, and then we have that pianissimo 3 bars in there. So we have a long note there at an end of a long phrase. So again, we have that D sharp that's going to probably be really sharp. So maybe voice it down a little bit or use just a C2 fingering. Our C sharp, that's going to be sharp as well. And we have, again, making sure we're re-articulating that tenuto 8th note that is tied to the note previously, making sure our 16th notes aren't rushed or cut too short or maybe played a little bit too long. And then that pianissimo, we have the crescendo poco a poco and a cello rondo. So what that means is we're slowly, again, just going to get louder and just a little bit faster leading up into that high palm key E, with the forte dynamic. That's where I got that F from. And this is going to set us up for the next section, which is quite different. So here's that part again, starting from the pianissimo. And be sure to hold that note for the full value. So let's move on to this middle and contrasting section here. So this is after our 2 measures rest, where we have that French, which means a little bit more lively and decided. So how do we make it more lively and decided? So up until that rest, we had that poco a poco, a cello and crescendo, right? So we're gonna, whatever tempo we end that a cello at is going to be the tempo for this next section. So hopefully we're getting to around 80 beats per minute there for that dotted quarter note. That'd be the tempo that I would feel comfortable playing this with. So we also have that forte marking that we wrote in there that I mentioned earlier on. just to help with this contrast here. So this part is a little bit more aggressive. It almost sounds kind of bluesy in a way, not that it's necessarily, you know, a jazz kind of stuff here. So the big things in this part is making it contrast to what has happened before. So doing what I just mentioned is going to help with that. And making sure our quarter note triplets are even. That is going to be a difficult thing. I'd like to think about this maybe in one beat rather than two. Triplet bum, triplet ba, something like that. And then looking at just that very first line of that section, the first quarter note triplet, we have a slur over them, but we also have those tenutos on each of those notes. But then 2 bars later, we don't have those tenutos, so we need to make sure that those sound differently. And making sure our palm key F is in tune, similarly to what we were talking about before, is maybe taking off a few of our fingers to help lower that pitch. And making sure we're just full of energy here. The energy is going to help, you know, move those lines, move those phrases, have that vibrato going. I know we're not talking a whole lot about vibrato here, but if you know how to do it, I would strongly encourage you to utilize it. So here's how I would go about this section here. So what do we do about that dotted 8th note, 16th note on the first beat of that last measure of the first line of the second page? That was a mouthful. So I'd think about that as if we're in just a simple meter here, thinking, you know, pretending that first beat is how you would play it in a bar of 2/4, let's say. So then we have that rallentando, which is kind of in a weird spot, but we're slowing down to the previous tempo, so that andante tempo. And then we have, after that tempo, we have almost the same exact material that we just did, but we're at piano now. So this is a spot where we're going to really have to keep this energy intense, exciting. We can't let any note, you know, falter. So here's how that would sound. So a louder dynamic here, lots of energy, and making sure our quarter note triplets are even. So thinking about those bars maybe in 1 rather than 2 might help you figure out in your brain how to play that triplet, and making sure we're consistent with that time, and making sure our tenutos versus non-tenuto triplets are different there. So then after this, we have a little piano interlude, and this piano interlude almost reminds me of some very impressionist kind of music. So I'm thinking of maybe some Debussy, maybe some Ravel. It almost sounds like maybe a river that's, you know, it's a slow stream, but you have a little bit of noise coming from it. And so that'll set us up for material that is exactly the same until the end of it from the beginning. So I don't need to really go over that because it's some of the same stuff, exactly the same stuff is going to apply to this part here as we talked about in the beginning. Some of the major differences are we're piano here, coming out of that piano interlude, but when we started the piece, we were at about a mezzo forte or so. And then we have where the same section where we mark the piano, where we go up to that funky D sharp. I would think of this maybe even as a pianissimo now. And this will give us a lot more room to grow, and it will contrast it from, the beginning when we played the same exact material. If you only go up to our A right above the staff there. So on that note, it is an atrocious note for us saxophonists typically. It's usually really sharp. Also, it is dependent on your horn, so maybe some voicing or adding an extra fingering on the right hand down to lower that pitch. The only thing that I don't like about adding those fingers is it just makes it kind of stuffy. So here's an example. So here's without any fingers on the right hand. And here's with our middle finger. And here's even it with our pointer finger, our fourth finger there. So it's a lot more stuffy, but that pitch is lowered. So I'd recommend just some voicing and lowering the throat there. So then after this, we have another 6-measure rest where we can relax a little bit and think of all the beautiful sounds that we've just made. And then we have a rallentando again into some material from the beginning. And we play this first little bit. Then we have a tempo marking here, plus lent, which means we're gonna play it even slower than what we just did. So what I would think of, I would switch to maybe thinking of in the 8th note rather than the dotted quarter note. So maybe like 108-ish for the 8th note here. So we're going from we're slowing down, we've got some good vibrato, we're pretty quiet here. And how do we play that last E flat at a triple P with good sound, good vibrato? So we can play it with our long fingering there, the normal fingering, but we could also do a short tube fingering here, which would be our C2, which is, we have our D key, which is C1, C2 is the next one, but then also we can add our C3 key, so the top key on our right hand stack right here, and this will give us that E flat. It's going to be a different timbre, it's going to be a different tone, and it kind of will help set up almost like a haunting and a colorful effect here. And it also could be better in tune too when we're playing at that quiet dynamic, because a lot of the pitch tendency for the saxophone is to get sharper the quieter we play. So here's the short fingering. So here, I'll play that example again using that short fingering. that'll be up to you. Um, if you like that tone difference there, if it works for you, if you can still make it sound pretty, it's in tune, you can have some good vibrato on there. And with that shorter fingering, it is a little bit easier to fade out on that. So that's what I have today for you for the Sicilienne by Pierre Lantier. I hope that was helpful, and I wish you the best of luck on your auditions. So just to kind of recap what we discussed today, um, mark in those things that I mentioned that are missing from the score. That'll help tremendously. Don't be afraid to write in your score either. I've looked back on some of my scores from when I was younger, in high school and even early college, and I would not write a single thing. I was afraid to mark it, mark up the score. But if you're missing an accidental over and over again, mark it in. And it'll help you having that, that visual cue, that reminder will make sure you play the correct note. Or, maybe we're forgetting to be full of energy in a section. Write down energy. Lots of exclamation points. Maybe, add a color. And so making sure our lyrical melodies are smooth and connected. Making sure we just have a beautiful tone for this piece, right? It's an absolutely gorgeous piece. So we need to make sure we're doing it justice in terms of our sound and melodies that we're presenting. Making sure we're re-articulating tenuto notes, especially in that introductory material, the main melody there. Making sure our 16th notes aren't rushed. It's very easy to do that in something like this, but just relaxing, that beat. Maybe even thinking thinking in 6 in those spots too, so we can really hit that 16th note right where we need to. Energy throughout. I've said that a lot of times. Intonation is going to be a big one. We can take off fingerings in the palm key notes to help lower that pitch. We can voice a little bit. Making sure that middle section towards the end of the first page is very different than the material that has happened before and will happen after. So louder, lots of energy here, kind of almost like some bluesy kind of stuff. And then again, making sure those quarter note triplets are even. And when we're after that louder section, we play the same material, rhythmic material at least, but at a piano dynamic. So keeping that energy consistent, even though we're playing quietly, we can still have a lot of energy and tension when we're playing quietly. And yeah, I wish you the best of luck, and I hope this was helpful. Thanks for watching.